Now, I met Sonal probably 3.5 years ago. I had heard about her a lot. I was back at HUD in Washington, and I was like, you've got to meet Sonal. She's really interesting. She has good ideas. She's trying to do great things. Her technical title is Deputy Assistant to the President, and she was the Director of the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. It's the first time that office had existed, so it was really a startup effort to help the federal government think about social innovation and civic participation, and the two of them going together to try to create enduring change. I got to know Sonal most effectively. We did a little hike down along the Potomac River. It wound up being a bit more involved than we thought. We got lost and stuff, but it gave us a chance to actually have some good conversation and some extra time together, and she was delightful. I'm really excited to have her for this talk because of her extremely diverse and varied background. She's been a leader in every sector, so she worked at Goldman Sachs as the vice president. She's worked in a leadership role at Google to help them with their philanthropic activities. She's been in the public sector. She started at the Treasury Department as an economist there, working in Africa on African issues as well as the Asia financial crisis, in addition to her work in the White House. And she has worked in nonprofits. So she founded a nonprofit called IndyCorps, which is to help do development work in India, but by people who are not necessarily living in India, and has also worked at the Center for Global Development, which also has really sought to promote economic development among the world's poor. And then the last thing I would say is that she's also had experience in more of our space, the thought space and the advocacy space. She's worked at the Center for American Progress. She has taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and she's currently working at the Case Foundation to help them think about how to do a lot of things around innovation. So tremendous background. She's also really nice and pleasant, and has seen so much in the world. And I should also say she is world traveler. So 2 days ago she was in London, and we pulled her out here. Tomorrow she has to be in New York, so she's bouncing around a lot. We are very privileged to have you. So thank you. Please join me in welcoming Sonal Shah.
So I think Raphael's being nice in that, when you're in government, you always hear a bunch of names thrown at you. And Raphael's name was one of the names that was being thrown at me, and he was like, you really have to meet Raphael, because he's been thinking about this from HUD, and he's been thinking about innovation. And then I show up in this meeting at the White House, and there's Raphael. and you find with innovation or with any of the things that you want to do with change, you're really looking for cohorts of people that are thinking the same way. It may not be exactly the way you think about it, but it's thinking about how the groups of people that are thinking about doing things differently might come together. And so I will talk to you about social innovation. I don't have a grand definition of it. I know I listened to Zab's talk. I know he gave his definition of it. I will say largely, I'll speak about it from the government perspective because that's the place where I was working most recently. I'll give you a little bit of perspective from where I'm at the Case Foundation and how some of the corporates are thinking about it. But more importantly, I think I'll approach this more broadly from the government perspective because that's probably where we implemented it most effectively. And when we thought about social innovation in the government perspective, we actually thought about what was the role of government first. And not trying to solve the whole world's social problems, but we are a large funder. Probably the largest funder. The government was the largest funder of social services more broadly. Second, it's got convening power. You can bring lots of people together. You put an invitation from any federal agency, and especially the White House, and all of a sudden people seem to want to show up at the event or the meeting. And we had an ability to use the voice of the president or the voice of the secretaries effectively, and that voice matters. So what they say, how they say it, you have to use it judiciously, but really thinking about how to use those tools that we have in the federal government most effectively. So from our office's perspective, we approach social innovation in probably 4 large buckets. 1, finance mechanisms. 2, how to bring new ideas to the table. The 3rd, data and technology, and the 4th, people. And I'll go through each of those. Finance mechanisms, really thought about, and this goes back to the government as the largest financer of social services in the United States. And really, we were thinking about how can we use finance differently to look at what's happening in communities, what's working, and then how can the government be thinking about this and from a scale perspective. Government's probably not the best at just funding innovation and thinking about innovation, but what we're good at is trying to say what's working in different places and how can we apply it more broadly, and how does the government think that way. It's not necessarily the way we think. There are some agencies that probably think that way, but broadly across government, we measure success by the number of people served. How many more people, how much more money went out the door, because that's the easiest metric to use, not because there are bad people not trying to do the right things. It's because everybody's asked to look at metrics, and in many ways from a congressional side, you're asked to make sure that the money got spent properly. So in spending the money properly, you follow the money trails and you follow how many people got served, what did we do, but we don't actually look at the one question that probably government should think about is what's the outcome we're trying to achieve. And the outcomes tend to be mostly divided very broadly. We want to reduce poverty. Great. But poverty has many indicators. Poverty has many ways of approaching it. We don't actually look at what exactly it is we're trying to do in poverty, or what agencies look at that, but more broadly when we think about it from where I was sitting at the White House, we had to be able to ask those questions and to be able to think about that. And then how do we give the flexibility to agencies to test these ideas that they may want to try differently? So the first place where we started was creating a fund called the Social Innovation Fund. And this was not a ton of money. It was $50 million. The idea of creating the Social Innovation Fund was to say we could give scale capital to organizations that had achieved some success. Those could be organizations that have shown success in one place and wanted to test it out in other places. It could be organizations that have shown multiple successes but needed to get to scale in a different way. But we didn't want the government to define how the money got used as much as they had to have scale of impact. That might have been investing in people. That might have been investing in data and technology. That might have been investing in opening up new offices, but the idea that scale of impact was more important. We didn't define what that was. What we defined in advance was they had to use evaluation techniques, and they had to use rigorous evaluation techniques. And even there, we didn't define exactly which technique, but rigorous evaluation was the broadest. So we would get data in as to what was working, and then to think about how do you reform and redefine these definitions over time, because what we found is not many agencies were doing rigorous evaluation anyway. So to then talk about a specific type of rigorous evaluation when no one had done it would have even defined the money even more tightly. So we needed to keep a more broad, open definition to that. And what happened with that was that we had then 2 other agencies. The Department of Education created an innovation fund called the I3 Fund. And now the Department of Labor also has a fund for workforce innovations out of their Workforce Development Fund, all of whom have a similar style to the Social Innovation Fund, but not all of them look at it exactly the same way. The Social Innovation Fund funded intermediaries. Government not funding individual organizations themselves, but the intermediaries who would then go fund other organizations or work with other organizations. The Department of Education's fund directly funds nonprofits themselves, not through intermediary structures. And that those are different models, but what we hope to get, and there's a separate funding group through philanthropic organizations that have created a What Works Center that is looking at these 2 innovation funds, and now the Department of Labor Innovation Fund, and trying to glean what are we learning from it. So they're funding research to think about what are we learning from that, because we don't want this just to be an agency's doing something, but we needed to step back and say what are we learning from those agencies and what they're doing. So the Social Innovation Fund was one example of really thinking about how do we think about impact. And what that helped us do is really convene internal conversations with agencies to say, how do we think about scale? What does scale mean? How do we think about giving flexible funding mechanisms that allow to think about scale? But it really kind of opened up a broader conversation, which wasn't just about the fund itself, but to think about that as a funding mechanism. How might we think differently with that? The second of the finance mechanisms that we worked on was social impact bonds. This idea had been used largely started actually in the UK. In the former government in the UK, they had started this conversation about social impact bonds. How do you work with private financing? This is actually a financing mechanism and not a social services mechanism. But how do you work with private financing with the government defining an outcome, a nonprofit or a third party coming up with the financing, and then really saying, did the outcome get achieved over a period of time that was defined? It was used on recidivism in the UK, where the Peterborough jail, a jail in the UK that had had very high recidivism rates, and still does. About 60% of the people coming in with nonviolent offenses usually come back at least 3 times. So you would think that the number of programs that the UK was funding, that something would have changed in this process, and they found that over periods of time, which is I think over a 27-year period, the rates had not actually changed. Yet the amount of funding for the programs had changed, and they hadn't seen any success. So they thought, somebody came to them and said, what if we were to raise private dollars of 10 million pounds, work with the Peterborough population that you all are working with the government, and we will manage funding different programs. If we can reduce that rate by a minimum of 10%, the government would give them a 7% return on those dollars. With a sliding scale return, if they could reduce it by 15%, then the government would give up to a capped 12% return on the dollar. So it's principal plus money. We could focus on the finance and who gets the returns and how they get the returns, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what was actually more important here is the government had to think about exactly what it is the outcome they were looking for. Which population were you thinking about reducing the rate? It's not the whole population. It had to be a certain part of the population. It had to allow the government to define more clearly and go internally and say, what is our data showing us, and what are the programs that have been working, and can we give that information to a third party that can start looking at that information? So it's almost a performance evaluation aspect of this that became very important. And then the third piece is it really started to force the government and the private agency, which was it's a nonprofit social finance, to start talking about what it is that they were trying to do, and making sure that the government was thinking about that there was no skimming. You weren't just looking at the easy population of prisoners, but you were looking at the whole population of prisoners. And understanding that conversation became a depth of, it was a 9-month conversation. It was not something that happened over a month. It was certainly not something that happened over 2 months. It took 9 months to actually negotiate this contract. Then there's the whole contract piece of it. How does the government pay over a 6-year period if you lose an election? How does the government pay over a 6-year period if the person in charge leaves? How do we make sure that the mechanisms are in place that if something gets achieved, it's being looked at? Who's the third-party evaluator that's going to validate whether the data is actually right or wrong? Because you don't want the government to do it, and you certainly don't want the nonprofit who's got the money to do it. You've got to have a third party that's doing that. So there's a whole contract negotiation aspect of this that's actually important. And then for the group that raised the money, there's a whole contract negotiation of who gets how much of the percentage of the profits. So does the private financier get all of the money, or does the nonprofit itself who's implementing it get some of the money? How does that money get divided? These are kind of the big conversations and questions. And I would say in the United States, these are still big conversations and questions that need to be defined over time. There might be certain contracts that look one way and other contracts that look another way. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done as to how do these contracts get written effectively. And there's not a lot yet being done on it. People are defining these contracts individually and trying to figure it out in kind of more of an experimental manner. But we took this idea and said, are there flexible funding mechanisms within the US government that allow for agencies to try this concept? We called it pay for success, not social impact bonds per se. Clever financing mechanisms to think about how to get to outcomes. And that pay for success model is currently, the Department of Justice has used it on recidivism, but also on homelessness, because there's a lot of people that are homeless that have come out of jails because they couldn't find jobs, and there's an aspect of that. There's the recidivism piece. Department of Justice has used it. Department of Labor has just closed an application process for impact bonds in cities who are competing for potentially funding for winners that will get money to do impact bonds in their cities. And different cities have approached it in different ways. I think they received about 12 applications. I don't know where they came from. I know some of them. I don't know all of them. And then I think there are other agencies like Department of Education and others where they could use them. We found that there were 7 agencies in the US government that had flexible funding mechanisms that could do it. That doesn't mean everybody did it. We found that there were 7 agencies that had the flexibility to test these models. And we wanted to give them the freedom to test it and to figure out. And then that required not only working with the agencies, it also requires working with their congressional bodies that oversee them to make sure that the congressional committees allow them to use the money flexibly. And that's an added aspect of, I think, the government side that sometimes gets overlooked, where it's not just trying a new idea, but it's also making sure that Congress allows you to try the new idea and working with that. And then the last, which is currently what's happening, and my successor who's working on this, is impact investing. So how do you, there are businesses that are, that can have social impact but also can earn money. And is there a role for government here? And we haven't yet, there's no necessary, we haven't come to a conclusion on what the role of government is in doing this, but how do we support businesses that can do social good but also make money? And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One is a company called Revolution Foods, which is based in San Francisco, California. They provide healthy meal options in schools. So in the structure of how much the government will pay for each of the meals, which is $1.80 per student or something like that. To date, I mean, we've all talked about this. We talk about the health consequences, and we talk about all of the issues with young people in schools and them not having access to healthy food options, yet all of the contracts that get given for food contracts don't provide healthier meal options. And so Revolution said, we can provide this. They wanted to set up a company. One could argue that they would have set up this company because the market demanded it. Yet when they went to go to the market to get money, nobody wanted to give them capital. So the people that actually gave them capital were philanthropies that invested in it out of their PRI portfolios, or individuals who wanted to take a little bit of that risk. That's where they got most of their capital at the early stages. They are today, I think, competing. I think they just won the San Francisco Unified School District contract to provide all of the meals in the city of San Francisco. I believe they're competing in Texas, in quite a few of the schools in Texas. They're also now beginning to compete in New Orleans and some of the other cities. So one could talk about the success of just that company, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about why the impact of this matters. The fact that Revolution is now wanting to compete in Louisiana has forced every other provider in Louisiana to think about what healthier options they're going to offer in their schools. So the impact isn't necessarily that the company is just successful. The impact is also everybody else saying, oh, we have to meet the same market demand. And it's a slightly different way of thinking of impact, when one could just talk about impact as, is the company making a ton of money, and are they, cornering the market? Or the fact is the market beginning to change because some of these companies exist? So that's one example of this. There's also a health company, and I don't have the name of this right, so I will come back to you on what the name of this company is, where they're looking, it's an insurance company, where they're looking at data differently, as when their clients are potentially could have diabetes, or they want to get them to go to the doctor to get checked out on a regular basis. They're providing incentives, forward incentives, not backward incentives. So if you go to the doctor, we'll reduce the payments on your medication. If you go do the following things, they're actually creating incentives in a different way. And that company is also beginning to look, they're growing at 30% a year right now in their health insurance market. I think it's also based out of San Francisco. But they're looking at data differently, because they're looking at data of their clients and saying, if they're prone to X, Y, and Z, we're gonna help them think about what incentive that works for them individualized. They're not looking at broad population, they're looking at individualized incentives to get people to change behavior, which at the end of the day, I think what we're looking at in social change is really thinking about how do we change behavior. But impact investing has a potential. I'm currently working at the Case Foundation to look at where the barriers to growth are in this space. What are the metrics that people might use to assess whether something's having impact or not, and what kinds of financial mechanisms can be used. So do we use current venture capital financial mechanisms? Are there other ways of thinking about this? Is it just foundation money that can come in? Can private wealth dollars come in? What kinds of mechanisms do they need to come in? So that's kind of the research I'm doing for the cases right now. Just broad research will say, I'll tell you a couple of things that I've learned. One, I think we tend to start with the metrics first and not with the finance mechanisms first. And so what happens is a lot of these companies get burdened with reporting metrics early on when they're early stage companies, of which when they're competing with other companies, it's really hard to meet all of the metrics that you need to meet versus I think one of the ways to think about this is can a company state its intent up front, can it define what metrics it will report on, and then let them report on it and let the market then decide which metrics are effective or which ones are not. But this is up for debate. It's not an answer that I have for this, but this is kind of one of the questions being asked. Can there be standardized metrics that get created in the way that LEED created metrics for buildings? How you build LEED standards gives at least a base level that everybody can work off of, and are there opportunities for standardized metrics? And this is one of the things. And then there's a whole education component. How do you educate people as to what impact investing is, and especially private wealth managers, which is where a lot of the requests are coming from. Big companies like UBS, Goldman Sachs, all of their private wealth clients want to be involved in this, but they don't know where to go or how to get trained to think about impact investing, impact bonds, any of these impact statements in a way that they don't know. So we're working on that. There's a lot to be done in terms of explaining to investors where they are on the spectrum. Are you in the early stage market creation where it's probably philanthropic dollars and you're not going to be using investment dollars? Do you want to be in early stage market creation where at most it's such a high risk that you might make some of your money back, but you might also lose it, but you have to know where the risk is. And then there's the scaling space where are the companies like Revolution that have the potential for scale. What we found is the negative criticism comes from the fact that majority of them think they're in the scale space, but really where they are is really in the market creation space. And so being very clear with this investors up front where they need to be and where they want to be and understanding their intention is actually really important, not telling them after the fact, but telling them up front as they are coming in. Some sectors like environment and energy, there's huge opportunities. And there's opportunities for the scale piece as well as the market creation piece. In others, healthcare has the same. In other cases like food distribution, it's still a growing market. There's so many new ideas being tested. It's not clear that all of them are working or whether it's even the right place to be, but there's some testing that has to take place. And that education is another place where education technology seems like a cool thing to do, but we don't really know what the impact is yet. And a lot of people are trying different ideas, but it's going to take some testing in the market to get there. So that's the finance mechanisms. The second part of this was new ideas and how do we open up to new ideas coming in. Sometimes in government, you don't really know what the best ideas are out there. And you think you can define the system as you do because of the past and the data that you have, but you don't really know, is there something orthogonal that we just didn't even think about? And that's where prizes and challenges became an important aspect of kind of opening up the government to thinking about prizes and challenges. The science agencies and the Defense Department already were doing this. The social sector, not quite so much. Largely because it's a data problem, largely because we just don't think about prizes and challenges in the social sector as much. And so allowing the ability for the social services agencies to think about how they might think about prizes and challenges differently. We ran a conference that brought in people that looked at prizes and challenges, allowed local each of the groups within the government to pitch their ideas and to think about where they might think about prizes and challenges. Prizes and challenges do exactly the same thing I would say that impact bonds do. It forces you to think about what it is you're trying to solve for. What's the prize has to be very clear. You don't just put out a prize for poverty, you put out a prize for something. And it has to be very clear what that something is. In the science agencies for NASA, it was like, we want a glove that can be used on the moon, and it's got to have the following features. So if you're going to define that, you have to think about it exactly the same way in the social services agencies. So that required a couple of things. One, allowing the agencies to do that. Although most of them had the ability in the government to do prizes, they didn't interpret their authority the same way. So legal problems. And we needed to create a legislative vehicle that allowed every agency to have the legal ability to run a prize, even though there was nothing preventing them from doing it. So if you actually read the legislation, there was nothing that said you couldn't do it, but their lawyers interpreted that you couldn't unless there was explicit authority. So in the America Competes legislation in 2010, every agency was given the authority to be able to run prizes and challenges if they wanted to. We then worked with GSA, the agency in the government that largely does most of the real estate, to create a website for prizes and challenges. Now, there were a lot of companies that wanted to offer free services to help create that website, but there was no legal way for the US government to take free services. So it required a whole set of legislative changes in allowing somebody to bid for $0. That's a different, so that was a 9-month process, but it was just working through those issues that actually mattered and understanding why and what were the changes. We could be mad at them, but it really took some time to get there to figure that out. Now I think if you go online, there's probably anywhere on a regular basis, probably 30 to 40 prizes that are constantly being run, both out of science as well as social services agencies, and each of them are looking at prizes differently. Sometimes they're really small, and sometimes they're big. Those are actually, it's an important way of thinking about how we can at least bring in new ideas that we hadn't otherwise thought about. The third is data and technology, so open data. This was something that the president talked about in the campaign. It was something that we had worked on and thinking about how do you make data that's existing in government more publicly available. Easy to say, hard to do. Great, we collect all this data, but we don't collect it in a unified way. We collect it in so many different formats, we don't even know if it's useful. A lot of it is collected because legislation required us to collect it, not because we thought about why we were collecting it. So the first executive order that the president put out was actually asking each agency to think about how they were going to make public data more publicly available. And that then led to almost a 2-year process of agencies thinking about what data they had, what could be made publicly available. And what didn't get reported, and actually what's the hard part of this, is you actually sometimes need more money to fix the systems to allow you to make that data publicly available and usable. Readable formats, ways that people can get access to it. All of that took some time to get there, and but it's important because we collect a lot of data. And the government requires collection of a lot of data, but to force then, the internal conversations that got forced were, are we even collecting good data? So that's actually changing a whole different round of discussions. Should we change the way we collect data? Are we collecting the right data? Should we be talking to our partners and thinking about what data is useful and what data is not useful? Those are the conversations that agencies start to have, but it's important. The data piece of this is by no means a small piece of kind of the platform that we worked with our colleagues in the Office of Science and Technology and making sure that that became a part of the broader conversation that we were looking at. And technology in the sense of how do we look at technology to interpret data that's out there. A lot of we put data out there and nobody knows it's out there. It kind of just, it's data for the data's sake. Our colleagues at the Department of Health and Human Services actually ran competitions on how will people use this data if we put it out there. And it was just an experiment. It wasn't even like we knew what was going to happen with it. But what was fascinating, it was a 1.5-year process by which they made the data available. They ran the competition. They worked with these organizations that were going to be a part of the competition. And what came out of it in the first round was 9 new companies got created because of data that the US government was starting to make public. Researchers started to look at the data in different ways because we were now making CMS data more publicly available, which is the data from Medicare and Medicaid. And that had not been made public in a long time. It was already normalized. We are the largest insurance company, and it was an ability to make that data public available. Types of people that use that data: real estate companies, looking at where are healthy communities, where might you want to buy a house, where might you want to live, where are the hospitals that have the best outcomes. Those are the types of things that we didn't even think about where and how people would use them, but they were interesting opportunities as to how data was being used, but how technology was looking at this data, and the tech companies were looking at this data differently. And then with the data and the prize piece, I would say it was not just external, there were a lot of internal things that happened. So give you an example of the Department of Veterans Services. VA, again, is the largest provider. I mean, it is the healthcare agency for all veterans. And they wanted to make their processes more efficient. So they started to run prizes internally as to if the 10 best ideas would get implemented by the Secretary of the VA. And the first round, they had 10,000 ideas come through online as to how they might just make their processes slightly better. What are the ways that they could do that? And because the Secretary did actually implement the first 10, the next round of the competition, they had 35,000 ideas that came through. Just to show that it didn't have to be from external people. Even internally, people know what's not working, but they needed a place where they could actually have their ideas being heard. And that actually was part of the process, that it wasn't just about the external stuff, but it was also about the internal. How do we change the way we think? How does government think about the way it thinks of itself? And then the last piece I will say, and this was all internal, had nothing to do with much of it, is the people aspect of it. How do you train people to think differently? It's not about just the fact that, you know, innovation exists and the government can talk about it, but it's who are your cohort of friends that you can talk to when you're trying something? Who are the cohort of people you talk to when we're trying to do things differently, and how did they do it? What could we learn from? So we created an internal working discussion with agencies on just the innovation folks that were working on innovation throughout the government. Some were civil servants, some were political appointees, and there was no level. You didn't have to be an assistant secretary or an undersecretary or a deputy assistant secretary. You could be a director of an office. You could be a person that was working on it from a particular office's they were doing innovation in their particular office. We didn't care. We just wanted to create a dialogue that allowed for people to learn from each other, and civil servants had access to politicals that were thinking about this from a different perspective, but it really created that opportunity to think. And what we learned in those conversations was, one, how each agency just interpreted the rules differently. The second, sometimes we were learning at VA, for example, aside from this internal competition, they were making a blue button available, which was every veteran could print out their medical record and take it with them. That meant they had to work through all of the legal issues that HHS is already thinking about. And so HHS didn't have to do it on its own. They could learn from the VA because they had just worked through all of the personal data. How do you get personal data? What about the privacy issues? They had just worked through that, but it allowed for cross conversations that were taking place. And also thought about, and it made us think about, how do we train people to think about how do you work within the system to change the system? It's not just about external pressure, it's also about the internal pressure and how to create that. That was kind of the broad ways that we approached it, and those were the tools of social innovation. I don't want to say these are the only things. This is the things that we had ideas to. These are the things that we worked with because people brought different experiences to the table on this. Those are some of the tools, and I think there are multiple others out there that we did not take on, but largely because we're a staff of 5 and working with a group of agencies trying to figure out how we could do. And we had to have some small wins in order to do other bigger things. And you couldn't start with the big stuff. You had to actually start with concrete things that you could do and show what was possible in terms of changing the system. Approaches were working with philanthropy, really thinking about how to partner with philanthropy differently. This is, Jim, I know you work on this in more detail than I do, but largely, our public-private partnership division had been all about a transaction. If the government can't pay for it, how do we get somebody else to pay for it? And if the private sector to pay for it, and if the private sector can't pay for it, how does the government pay for it? It was largely a transactional thinking about how to work with philanthropy. Here, we were looking at how do we solve a problem together, and what does philanthropy bring to the table versus what do we bring to the table? In some cases, it was philanthropy running the prizes and paying out the prizes. It was the government helping and working with philanthropy to define what the prize could look like because we had all the data internally. In some cases, it was joint funding of projects. In other cases, it was philanthropy taking the risk capital with the government thinking about the scale piece of that. So, but there were lots of different, it has opened up a new conversation on what partnerships should look like and what could they look like. And I would say, and Jim and I talked about this earlier, and there's probably a lot more work to be done on what's actually worked and what hasn't worked, and where are some lessons learned on how these public-private partnerships could be done differently as opposed to just a transaction. Working with local and national governments. So the national government can do lots of things, but a lot of our money is just a direct transfer to state and local governments. So how do we work with state and local governments when you're trying to be innovative, but you can't really force someone to do it? You have to really think about how your mechanisms can work differently. And the impact bonds is certainly one way that's allowed for flexible funding that allows the state and local governments to apply, but there's different ways of thinking about that. Impact investing, a lot of the stuff is actually happening at state and local levels, not really at the federal level, and what can we learn from there to bring back. But this is kind of opened up a conversation as to how do we look at data across governments differently, because we currently push data out and we push information out, but we don't actually bring information in as to what we can learn from that. Working across agencies. If there's anything that this group learned is sometimes we don't even talk to the people that we should be talking to. So the example I will give is Department of Education, Department of Labor. We sometimes fund things out of other agencies because that's the legislative vehicle that was moving. So funding for community colleges actually sits in the Department of Labor, even though the expertise is in the Department of Education. And why? Because that was the funding vehicle that was going, and we need to get $20 billion out the door, and so now the Department of Labor has the money, but the Department of Education has the expertise and the data in which to do this, and then that's created a whole set of conversations as to how does an interagency agreement work in terms of sharing of data and information, and which committee has, so it's a political issue on this, but it requires us thinking about how do we, if what we want is to improve community colleges and make community colleges effective, what is the tool that is needed that can help us work across these agencies? And how do we solve for making community colleges better and then figuring out how the agencies work on it, as opposed to which agency has jurisdiction versus which agency does not have jurisdiction? Another example we could look at is foster care system. A foster care child probably touches, I think on average, about 12 to 17 agencies in their lifetime. And we don't look at the child, we look at when that child leaves, that agency then looks at them, but we don't say, how do we keep this child from going off into jail? Or how do we keep this child in the education system? What we look at is when does this number go out and touch that agency, and when does this number go out and touch that agency, at what age, at what time? But we don't look at the individual, we look at the system. The system kind of operates on its own without thinking about the individual. So, and one place where we had thought about an impact bond, which is another where it crosses agencies, is the Social Security Administration working with folks that have disabilities, and with the Department of Labor, because folks that have disabilities but actually can work don't know how to work with the Department of Labor to get job training to get jobs. And yet, so they end up staying on Social Security for a lifetime, as opposed to they could actually get off of Social Security for a period of time and actually earn more money and come back into Social Security over another period there. But those are questions that we have, and these are the places where some of these questions have to think about how do you do that. And the last is how do you work with the private sector? Government has a very tough conversation with private sector because there's so many different places that there's conflict of interest issues, there's other issues, but that's also where a lot of the money is sitting. And so are there ways to think about mechanisms that allow us to learn as to what the private sector is doing? And I'm not trying to say that the private sector has it all right. I'm just saying that there are some of the solutions and problems that you see in communities, all of them have to work together. Housing is probably the place where it happens the most, but are there ways that we can work on that? So I'll end it with a couple of lessons learned, and then I'd like to just open it up to conversation, because I think this is where the most interesting piece of this is even going to be for me. Innovation in social innovation, process matters. It's not just about the idea of social innovation and we're going to top-down hammer it into people's head, but how do you create a process that allows for innovation to take place at the social level, and what's that process look like? And that process innovation is almost more important than just the innovation itself, because understanding how to work it through a system matters. People, investing in people, we don't actually do enough of the investment in people. We just assume that people are going to figure this out because we say the term innovation. What does it mean? What is this agency? What does the person that's thinking about it want it to be? Because that definition from that perspective matters a lot. You can't just use and throw the term around, because there's no it's not a generic enough term. It's a term that matters to whoever's applying it. And investing in people to think that way, investing in people to think about process, investing in people how to work through a process is actually important to get there. And I'll do that. Research. There's no research out there. We are throwing this term around with not a lot of data and not a lot of information as to what works. And we need to understand what works. I was just telling Raphael earlier today, the UK has just designed us these what works centers in cities across the UK to understand what's working in social innovation, so they can actually start capturing that information in and thinking about what is useful evidence and how do they use that evidence to then apply it in other places. We need a lot more of that. Universities certainly have a unique place and ability to do that, but understanding why a policy change should happen with this idea of innovation matters that we understand what's happening. Cities and states are trying a variety of different things. It would be great to capture what's happening, and then understanding if some city comes and says, what should I do? It would be great to understand what factors worked in city X versus what factors might work in city Y, and that's not, right now everybody's just going around saying, well, we're doing this here, so you should do the exact same thing. Well, situational contexts matter a lot, and understanding that. Data, Gary, we talked about this earlier. Data is an important aspect of this. How do we look at data differently? How do we look at data orthogonally, not just from my agency's perspective, but can I look at what's happening in HHS as to what might happen with how labor might think about their policies differently? There are ways, when we're looking at health and labor, matters a lot. I mean, there's actual clarity of, why are people not coming to work on a regular basis? Are there communities that are healthier, that are more productive? Are there not? What are the things that we should be looking at? I'm making up data right now, but data is important. And how we look at data cross-sectorally is something that would help a lot, not just from one perspective, but just looking, if data is going to be released, can we look at data differently? And that's important. Collaboration. We all talk about collaboration, but we don't actually do collaboration. Technology makes collaboration easier, but we haven't yet figured out how to use that tool effectively, and that's, I think, a skill set that's going to be very important going forward. I was telling someone earlier, it's funny in the White House, even though you would think that there's only 400 people there and you should collaborate better, it's all based on competition model, whose idea wins and whose idea gets heard, as opposed to thinking about what it is we're trying to do, and then how do we figure out what we're trying to do as opposed to whose idea it is. And it shouldn't matter whose idea if we can figure that out. Then the last two, legal. I mean, I've mentioned it in some ways. The legal issues are not small issues. And understanding how to work through the legal system and how to work through a legislative system, I think incorporating law schools and how they think about how laws get written and where the flexibilities might be and where that gets written, especially in legislation, is something that's not even talked about enough. And yet, everybody that writes the laws are lawyers. They're not policy people. They're not public policy students. They're not even researchers. They're lawyers. And they're writing things so precisely that it leaves no room for flexibility. And how do we think about the legal system that allows for some of those changes to happen, where people don't read this stuff so narrowly, but they might give us opportunity to think about this as something worth thinking about. And the last bit, which is on social innovation, which is interesting, is the international perspective on this is where a lot of the change is actually happening. Because they don't have the constraints of changing systems, they're just building systems in healthcare and education, energy, and there's probably some good lessons learned on what's happening internationally that we might think about bringing domestically. On technology, certainly we're beginning to see a lot of technologies that were created for the international coming in domestically. So I'll give you one example. Ushahidi.com was created in Kenya by a group of students at the University of Kenya, Nairobi. And the idea of the technology was to let people know through SMS where a disaster, where fights were taking place in their community so they can avoid going to those areas when the elections in 2007 happened and there were a lot of riots. That same technology then became the platform that the US government used for Haiti, to figure out where we needed to provide food, because it was such a simple technology. It's just SMS. There's no smartphone aspect to it. There's no major, it's not complicated. It's just, how do I send an SMS short code in saying certain, giving just enough information that gets gathered in one place and then gets out to other folks very quickly. Not complicated. You don't need complication. What you need is a simplicity of use that allows for communities to use that. Ushahidi has now become a platform that a lot of other governments are using around the world, but it's something, looking at these types of examples and looking at what's happening internationally might also give us some idea. Finally, we all talk about disruption as if it's like a cool thing and, isn't it great, we should have more disruption in the system. It's uncomfortable. It's gonna create loss of jobs, it's gonna create loss of incomes, it's going to create change. It makes people uncomfortable that they know how to do their job in a certain way. And not recognizing that disruption is uncomfortable makes it hard to make change. Because it is uncomfortable. It is not a conversation politicians necessarily want to have, but it's certainly a conversation we need to have, that in order for some of this change to happen, and there are already disruptions in the system, that we're going to have to make a lot of people uncomfortable. It's going to be a question of how do we help those people that are uncomfortable come into comfort, not necessarily that the comfort isn't going to exist. So I will leave it at that, and I will allow, please ask me any questions. I will tell you what I know and what I don't know. I have lots of views on what works in government and what doesn't, and certainly what works in philanthropy and what doesn't, and I'm happy to be honest about it.
There's a literature on innovation, and in fact, our former colleague here, Ev Rogers, wrote this book on diffusion of innovation.
Yeah.
So one issue is, this notion of best practices. I mean, you kind of touched on that toward the end. And then what happens after the innovation takes place? How much of that actually gets diffused? So the transferability, the diffusibility, if that's the word, whether one to the medium, then how much of these kinds of thinking come into play? I mean, the way you have described your experience mainly from the government sector, although you have other experience as well. So is it really the innovation, when you call it, I'm still trying to figure out what social innovation is. It seems like the innovation in delivery of social services, maybe that's one way of interpreting the kinds of things talking about. So, and the other interesting question is how, like in the case of concept of the social capital is a great thing, but how do you create, in the field of planning, you talk about how, you should build social capital, but who builds it and how do you start it, So I think that kind of question is kind of implicit in here too. I mean, how do you, what are the sort of the conditions or circumstances that could lead to innovation? And the other thing I thought is, I'm kind of throwing out a bunch of stuff. If you think about the ad agencies, they make up these 1 second, 1 minute or 30 seconds, whatever, the commercials and so forth. Some of them are very, very creative, But the cartoon picture of that is a bunch of guys sort of sit around the table and then they just come up with the weird ideas, and then if something catches on, the client likes it and they go with it. So it's sort of like the old-fashioned brainstorming. So does that kind of an opportunity exist within the federal government when you get a bunch of creative people like Raphael, yourself, and others, and do brainstorming about things? Does that
That's a great question. Both great questions, and I think yes, I think this idea of how innovations get dispersed is a question that I think partially it's that we haven't even talked about social innovation broadly enough that everybody knows what it is we're trying to disperse. So I think capturing some of that information would be valuable, and I think government's starting to do that, but again, I think sometimes external agencies doing it is much better than the government itself, because it's hard to have failures in government. It's a lot easier if someone talked about it from the outside, because nobody wants to talk about what didn't work. Everybody only wants to talk. There's no incentive to talk about what didn't work. There's only incentive to talk about what worked. And that, in government, that's a slightly harder proposition, at least at the federal level. I'm not talking about state and local levels here. But understanding how it gets diffused, how people take different pieces of that, where something got started for one intent but is being used for others would actually be great to know. Even stories of that would be great to know, because it's important to understand how it's working and how the mindset changes are also taking place. So would say yes, we need more of it. Don't know where it's happening enough, to be fair. In terms of the design thinking process, which is bringing there are governments that are beginning to pull that in. So I know in New York that happens. I know in Chicago it's beginning to happen. I know it's happening in San Antonio, where somebody's coming together and creating a design thinking process, and they're bringing in these new agencies that do design thinking that allow for different groups of people to come together and say, we want to solve for X, so they'll bring in the engineering department, they'll bring in the education department, but they'll bring in a group of people that might not necessarily be talking to each other to really think about this problem. I know one of the things that the government has been thinking about is whether they might allow for people to, they might start doing trainings when they do government trainings, federal government trainings, on design thinking. So how do you think about a problem differently? But I think it's a great opportunity to think about how do you take this process of bringing new people to the table. Yes.
Schools,
yes.
Right? They don't really give any degrees or anything.
No. They are bringing that together. Yeah, D-School, and there's a few others that are, NYU is beginning to look at that also as a way of thinking about that, and I think Harvard's just created I don't know, an innovation place where they can do some of that, but it's not yet the process by which they get there. But yeah, absolutely, I mean, it is what's needed, is how do you bring people that might not otherwise, that's what Google did really well, I have to say, is like we would work on a technology, but we would bring in a sociologist, we would bring in an education specialist, we'd bring in a healthcare specialist, and then we have the tech people. And then we'd be thinking about the problem with all of them at the table fighting it out, because it led to a generally better process and a better design because there were a group of people looking at it from wholly different perspectives. And I think there are things from companies to learn in this space where some of the tech companies are actually thinking about bringing in new ideas and new players to the table to think about solving some of those problems. And we could use that in government, but we should also broadly in the social sector in general, we should think about, it's easy to get to expertise, but it's not always the experts know what they know, but we don't always know what we don't know. And bringing people who might bring that other thinking to the table is a great point. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
You talked about early stage market creation versus being in the scaling space, and how do you know, right? So you noted that many of the funders want to be at scaling too soon. How do you know when it's too soon? Or what are the signals that you would look for? I mean, is there a canon for that? Or?
Yeah. On this one, I'll just know because everybody's like, there's no pipeline. We don't know where else to fund. Where do I find the next big company that might make it? We don't have a pipeline of those companies. And it's partially because no one's investing in the early venture stages of Series A or Series B or very just early funding stages. And it's funny because we have this huge, like when we go on a fund social good, we're like, they have to meet all of these metrics, and therefore if they don't, they will fail. And so we put failure on it so quickly as opposed to willing to say, okay, well they tried this, it didn't work, let them modify their model and see what happens to it. We're very restrictive in our thinking as to what is good and what is not. And I think we need to learn from that a little bit. So one lesson of the early stage stuff is there are more people looking at this, but it's largely come from philanthropic dollars, and there's not a lot of philanthropic dollars out there. Philanthropy isn't exactly risk-taking. You would think they should be, but they're not exactly risk-taking. They want all of their I's dotted and their T's crossed, and they want to know that percentage of failure. When you think about business people, large numbers of venture capitalists actually were funded based on the person, not because of the idea. They thought if the person could figure this out, the idea would evolve over time. It's not the way we approach it in the social sector. We're like, if you look at some of the big foundations, they're like, what's the big social change you want to take place? What's your theory of change? You know, what are all the factors of theory of change? And we'll only fund it if it falls within that realm. But what if we don't know? What if we should just try something that might be a little bit more random, a little bit harder to know whether it fits in that theory of change? What's the risk? I worry sometimes that in this need for data and the need to get everything right, that we forget that sometimes we just need to fund an innovative idea that might not fall into any of those theories. And it's hard because the balance is you can go one way too far and the other way too far, but where's that room for risk?
So having done procurement, right, I mean, the one thing you want to be able to be is fully accountable.
Yes.
And to say for every dollar, I know exactly what they're going to spend it on, and if they don't spend on it, and something goes wrong, you say, well, they did something that I didn't ask them to do. This says, I can't know X ante, which is probably the right thing, because things happen all the time. How do you balance that? I mean, because you know, like the things like Solyndra or whatever, when it goes bad, it can go really bad, and then you can be kind of dragged through the coals. Is there a way to mediate that?
Raphael, I'd say that it's harder in government. So I say things, so I'm not sure if government's going to be the place where pure innovation happens, because congressionally, nobody wants to hear failure, and nobody wants to. Solyndra is a great example. Yeah, we allow it in the Defense Department. We just don't allow it in. It gets obscured in a lot of money. But if it comes to energy, or if it comes to other places, we're not willing to take as much risk in doing some of that. But if you wanted to fund Amazon, and the government were funding Amazon 10, 20 years ago, it didn't make money for 10 years. It was in the red for 10 years before they actually got to black, and because they were changing the way distribution systems worked, they were changing the way the technology system worked, they were changing their technologies on a regular basis, and somebody took that risk, which was largely the private funders, to say the idea is still right and it's going to change a system, but the only way to do it is to keep betting on it. And they bet on it for a period of time. And yet, every venture capital portfolio that I've looked at has 80% failures and 20% successes. The successes are so good that the failures are never talked about. But we don't do that. We can't do it in the social sector because there's so many costs to it, right? It's just like, what happens if somebody's life gets, we're not even willing to take the risk sometimes in some cases. But it's a hard question I don't have an answer to. I think it's that question of where's that balance of risk versus testing that. But if we take some of the examples from the private sector, they've been willing to take risks in a way that failure is okay and accepted. But we just only talk about the winners because the 20% are so big. Like Google is so big that every other failure that they had in that portfolio didn't matter.
I have kind of a parallel question, and it kind of goes to the importance of evaluation and I'm very fascinated with the UK model of actually having these local trackers of what's working and so on. That seems really interesting to me. But here's a wild idea. Let's be entrepreneurial government, okay? And we're going to try the transparency approach. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide information about here's the success rate of venture capitalists. Here's the success rate of big corporations. Here's this effect, And so we're going to be transparent, and we're going to show our success rate too. So what's wrong with that?
It makes government really uncomfortable to be that transparent.
But you told us, it's a matter of let's try to make people comfortable. So.
I don't disagree with you. I think it requires from a personal perspective, I think if government were more transparent and more honest about what the decisions were and how they made them, I think it would make it easier to say. My take on Solyndra was, why not go out there and say, you know what? We had to make some bets to see if some of these things win, rather than backing away and being afraid that we made the wrong decision. It tends to become the government system is so defensively oriented. There's no offensive aspect to it.
There's no upfront saying, we're going to create this program, and we know that.
Correct.
It's
going to be.
The probabilities are,
yes.
And and that's actually, it seems like maybe that's the sales pitch. I mean, that's what we should be having, Congress buy into, right?
Right.
This is what we're going to do, and we know up front, and you have it on record. And, we're going to be entrepreneurial government, just like, that this is what we admire in this country, right? All this risk-taking, so.
So two things on that. So I don't disagree with you. Government is all defense, no offense at all times. And it's a gotcha government. The three parts of government spend all of their time doing gotcha. Caught you cheating, caught you giving money to your friend, caught you. So if I were to say, I wanted to make some bets like this, and I want to make bets on people, and I know that they've had successful track records, they might fail, but they've had track records that are somewhat successful. The way the system actually works, the procurement system works, is like I have to put it out to bid. I can't even interview you. I just got to do it based on the paper documents that you sent me, not the interview process, right? You think about it from a university perspective. Sometimes you bring a student in because of the interview, not because of what they looked on paper, but you look at that person and you're like, I just want to make a bet on that person. And I think that person's worth making a bet on. You can't do that in government. I can't interview you, I can't talk to you, I can't, which is why the intermediary model in the Social Innovation Fund was actually important, is that it allowed the intermediary to do the interview process in a way that we couldn't do the interview process. So unless we're willing to figure that out and say, how do we allow bets to take place, and how do we allow to make a bet on a person and an idea and something, and be transparent about it, but at least allow that to happen, it's not going to change because the system is geared towards everything about the gotcha. And this is why I go back to the legal issues, which is it's lawyers writing a bunch of these rules that are like, I just want to keep you from getting the gotcha. And the press then builds upon that, which is like, it's all about the gotcha and it's all about the mistakes that you made. It's really not about it's not about the process. So if systemically you want to change the way you think in the social sector, it's got to be a systemic aspect of all of these places that need to think differently and to say it's okay to take some risk. We've gotten to, you look at the current debates that are taking place in government, it's about no risk. It's about how little can we spend and how much do we know where the money actually got spent exactly. We never say whether it actually worked or it didn't work. It didn't matter about that. It's just a matter of try having this discussion, and we do with the Republicans and the Democrats, of like, let's fund what works. They're like, no. Because they want money for their constituencies. They get elected for how much money they bring in. They don't get elected for things working. I mean it in a, and I don't mean to be negative about it. So I think one aspect in the part that I didn't talk about, where there's some interesting places where they're beginning these deliberative democracy conversations of asking communities to start asking these questions at a more deliberative level. It's happening more internationally than domestically, but it's actually changing the conversation at the deliberative level. So favelas in Brazil are participating in their budgetary processes. In India, they're working at deliberative democracy at very local levels, thinking about where do our budgets go, how do we think about how we want our government to run. There's a very interesting process of that where people are beginning to say we want to be in charge of something, and it's not just a top-down approach. But the top-down pieces, I'm only giving you all the problems. I don't have an answer to this question. I would love to see more transparency. Yeah, I would love to see more transparency, but I think this is where probably at the municipal and the state and the city levels there could be a lot more stuff happening because it's a lot more flexible than it is at the federal level.
So that was my question. So why is the federal government in this business at all? Just make it happen at the local level.
People are looking at the federal government for ideas. Like half of the stuff that came to us was. We can still convene the right groups of people. We can still even make some amount of money. Social innovation and impact bonds would not have happened at the city and state levels had the federal government not been talking about it. Because cities are so busy in their little things working on the things that they would have never seen what the UK and the Australians were doing. The ideas came from UK and Australia. It didn't even come from here. There's no city that I know of that's looking at what's going on in Kenya right now or India. Kenya's become one of the tech entrepreneurship hub of Africa. And nobody's looking at that, but the State Department is. And certainly USAID is, because that's where they're working. So there's an opportunity that the federal has is to see what's happening in different places and say, how do people learn from each other? The federal government talking to Bloomberg's office and then linking them to what's going on in San Antonio would not have happened had it not been that somebody was looking at where Bloomberg was and what was happening. So I'm not saying that the federal government is the only player in this space. I think the federal government has a convening power, and this convening power is not a small thing, and how it uses money. Large amount of money that comes from the cities and states is all from the federal government. It's a direct transfer that's taking place at SSBG and CDBG, right? And those grants that are large chunks of dollars with no requirements. It's just a direct transfer of dollars that's taking place. But if the government were to say, hey, we think it would be great if you tried some of these things, you now begin to see cities say, what is that? So the implementation is going to happen at local levels because they have flexibility to do it. I think what you have is where could a government allow for ideas to be transferred and tested, and who can you learn from? So I think what the government could do is actually more of these what works centers that allows cities to come there and say what's working. So it's a way of, and I think to your answer, I'd say maybe that is the question we should be asking: is what role should the federal government play? And yes, the office that existed did one thing, but maybe it should morph into something else. And what should that look like? But that absolutely is a great question to be asking, because if we want to do innovation, what role should the federal government be playing, and how do they play a role that's effective?
So you said something that in passing that I'm still puzzling over about how we are able to tolerate failure with the Defense Department, but not others. And I thought of some cynical reasons perhaps, but is there something about the structure, the relationship between Congress and the department that allows for quote unquote experimentation more there than
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough.
I think of cynical reasons.
I don't know enough about defense to be able to give a full, a true answer to this. I'll give you somewhat of a, a qualified answer of just, I think part of it is they early on created DARPA, which was the agency that actually did experimentation as an early discussion that got created. Now there's an ARPA-E that's similar to DARPA at the Department of Energy because of DARPA, but it's almost 30 years later that this got created. But DoD early on said we needed a place where innovation had to be tested and tried, and the Congress funded DARPA for that innovation perspective. I don't know what the full acronym stands for, so it's a good question. Yeah. It's where a lot of the prizes and challenges on defense come from. It's a lot of where some of the testing takes place. But DoD had that early on, and their contractors, I think in their budgets, are given ability to try new things and to test those ideas. And my guess is that the conversations that take place with their congressional committees is very different from the conversations that take place with other congressional committees. That's my guess. I don't know the answer to this as deeply, but I know DARPA is one big part of the fact that it's already been a part of who they are.
Branded innovation in that way, so it gives them an umbrella to try to
Yeah.
answer it.
And some of the agencies also don't have, and others may have answers to this, but some of the agencies don't have as strong of an oversight in exactly how the money gets spent as much as it is about did the jet work? Yeah, and do you feel safer?
I guess, because if you think about it, like transportation also has an innovation funding mechanism. So I guess some of it might come down to the question of experimenting on humans as opposed to experimenting on scientific. So like, I mean, if you think about it, we don't really experiment on humans. I mean, there were times when the government did experimental.
HHS.
Health,
we do it all the time.
No, I was saying, so moving to opportunity is probably the most well-known recent large-scale experiment. But in terms of thinking about experimentation, there are ethical questions about, at what point, if we know something seems to be doing a better job, do we have to expand that to everyone? And kind of, is it ever, ethical to try something that might lead to negative outcomes? It seems like that's kind of in the back of people's minds about these, because innovation comes from experimentation.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I would say the alternative is we're in a system where inequality is growing, and the high school dropout rate is still 20 to 40% in schools across the country. Like, the alternative isn't better. And so the idea that we can't do experimentation because we think the alternative is better is even harder for me to stomach, to say we shouldn't try and be innovative and think about new approaches to doing stuff. Yes, it's harder to do it on humans. Yes, it's going to be harder but I look at places like India, and it's like the government system in education sucks. And they spend $19 billion a year on social services. Foreign aid is nothing compared to what they spend domestically. And private schools in India are the fastest growing schools at $2 a day. The private sector is experimenting, whether we like it or not, on people. And they're winning. And we're not even thinking about it from a government perspective because we're afraid to try. I just put it on there.
Once we see what works, then we say, okay.
They're not talking to the government about what's working.
Right, but the goal would be the government would look to them and see.
But we're not. That's my point. Government isn't even doing that. It's like, it'd be great if we were thinking that far ahead and saying what's working. We're not even doing that. So maybe it comes back to what's the role of the federal government? Should we be looking at what's working in the private sector? Should we be looking at where are experiments taking place, even at local levels with nonprofits and other places, or with philanthropy, and bringing that together? It's a question. I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm saying it's a question we should be asking. because the alternative is the systems aren't working for people better. In some cases, in small cases, they are, but the whole overall system, if, in the jail in New York City at Rikers Island, the recidivism rate is 80%, like, what's the problem that we can't seem to solve for this? That's for young kids from the ages of 18 to 25. Like, what exactly are we leaving for them in the future that's better if we don't test at some point? Sorry, you had to. Yeah.
I wanted to build off of the program evaluation idea of how do you account for contextual differences? Because a lot of ideas are site-specific or city-specific, so how do you know when it's going to translate to another city, or do you have a way of knowing that?
I don't know that we know, and I think some of this is going to be actually experimentation. It's trying something that works in one place and allowing it to be tested in another place in a controlled way that allows that to happen. We tend to want to think it's just going to scale because it worked in city X and it should work in city Y, and it's not true because of the contextual issues. In some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't, but the factors have to be similar. And doing micro experiments on a regular basis actually wouldn't hurt us to do that. We tend to want to do macro, large experiments over large, long periods of time, but I think one of the things that we should figure out is how to make it cheaper to do these experiments, and then how do we do it on a continuous basis so it's not just over big time spans, but you can test in small time spans too. But it's a great question, and it's something that I think we're beginning to look at now. I know the Office of Management and Budget, I know a lot of the evidence-based nonprofits as well as agencies are beginning to ask this question themselves and say, how do we make it cheaper, but how do we do continuous experiments as opposed to one just long-term experiment, and then and have both of those. The one thing I will say for all of you that are students is really do think about government as a career or a place to work at least some point in your time, because I will say I've never felt more innovative in a place than when I was in government. You think that the system itself is so hard to work within, but because if you figure out how the system works, which is what matters, you can actually figure out and try a bunch of things that sometimes nobody's paying attention to because it's not a big enough issue. It's not big enough for somebody to pay attention to. It's not $20 billion, it's not $100 billion, it's $1 million or $10 million. It seems small here, seems big here, it's not that big when government, when you're talking about $10 to $20 million. But imagine if some of those things work, how much of an impact it has on communities. It doesn't have to be just at the federal level, it can be at state and local levels, which is directly where the impact is happening. It's not happening just at the federal level, it's happening at many different levels. And I can't imagine a place to work that isn't ripe for innovation, but given what's going to happen in government in the next 20 years, which is almost a third of the workforce will be retiring, it only opens up the opportunity to do interesting things. And it's a huge opportunity to think about it. You can do it from the outside, but you're going to have institutions working differently. It's not just about the nonprofit sector doing more. It's not just about philanthropy doing more. But even for philanthropy and nonprofits to work and to scale, the institutions have to change. And the biggest institution in this sector is government. And it's going to require a change. And it's going to require some way of thinking about change. Not just changing itself, but thinking about how change happens and where and how do they play a role in that. So I urge some of you, I know it's easy. I know it's also easy to leave these places where sometimes you have these big debt burdens. You're like, I can go work at McKinsey. Great place to work. Some point in your career, think about the government. It doesn't have to be immediately, but think about when and how you might take a role in government at some point in your time, in your careers, in a way to do that. Because I can't imagine a more innovative place to have worked in the last decade. And I've worked at Google and at Goldman.
Any last questions? Yes?
I have a quick question. You mentioned CDBG really briefly,
Yeah.
just about that system is sort of built to remove a lot of the restrictions, that identifying exactly what it is about a program that's working, because the experimentation, like socially, it's not like a chemical compound that either lowers your cholesterol or it doesn't. Like it's nuanced and it's complicated and every city's different, and sort of like we're talking about what would a system look like that's sort of based on the CDBG model of flexibility and of sort of local discretion of removing the liability and allowing the risk, and giving the luxury to try new things without having, these like world is falling apart results if something doesn't go right, if your metric was off or something like that. How would that scale more nationally so that the CDBG things that we see on the ground that are actually going out to programs, how could you take that culture and put it federal?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I'll give you a theory behind it more than I know the answer to this. I think part of it is it's a data problem, which is how do we help these communities allow them to do the experimentation, but also come back with information as to, are there regulatory issues that need to change to make it easier for you to do? Sometimes it's not a monetary problem. Sometimes it's a regulatory problem. Sometimes it's a systems problem. The reason you can't do it is I can't use that funding, and the reason I can't do it is I can't use that funding, but I know what I want to do. And the restrictions might be a change of rules as opposed to a change of legislation, which is not always a legislative issue, and then being able to capture that information and move it up and see if at the national level we can understand that's happening at 30 communities, at 5 communities, at 25 communities. Like, we don't even know the answer to that question. And if you're trying to change something and change the rules, but it's only going to affect 5 communities and not the other 80 communities, then you want to know that you're making a rule change that's going to affect more communities and if it's actually going to have an impact or not. Those are actually important questions I think at the national level people need to be asking. But at the local levels, capturing that information and saying, here's what we're trying to do and here's why it worked or didn't work, and being able to move that up the system and say, we need more if we want to do the following things. But it requires a dialogue between the two to say, can the national start asking these questions, and can at the local levels, are they thinking about it in that way? But it probably is more of the design thinking process of how do you bring design thinkers to thinking about what it is we're trying to do, as opposed to just go do innovative stuff. And I could say innovative is investing in 3 nonprofits that call themselves social entrepreneurs. I could say innovative is using social impact bonds. But you got to have some framework in which we all agree that this is where we're looking to test the ideas. CDBG requires, and Raphael knows more about this than I do, I think they're really rethinking what their role is and how, when they give the money, are there restrictions. And a lot of times for the governments, it's just a budget filling gap. It's not there's no innovation in this because it's a budget filling gap. You're like giving transfers, and currently it's exactly what it is because so many of the local governments don't have enough money. They're just taking that money and filling in the budget. And so we're asking for innovation when what they're using their money for is budget filling. We have to be careful that you're not trying to ask them to do something that they just don't even have the capacity to do right now. So these are kind of the bigger questions that have to take place. Maybe in good times when local governments have more money, you can think about this. But in current times, it's a direct transfer to fill a budget gap. And I'm sure of that.
Can I ask just one quick follow-up on that? Do you think it's possible at a more national level to create a sort of culture or environment where you could decouple the outcomes from the specific? So to me, at a local level, that's kind of the power of CDBG, is that we know that these things are working, and we may not know exactly what it is about your model, but we know that you're getting results. So not requiring us to pick this apart and try to scientifically identify something that may not be scientifically identifiable because this is a social thing. So is it possible to maybe do that decoupling? It's like, whatever it is that you guys are doing, we're gonna, I know this is a luxury thing that right now we really don't have, but to kind of take that freedom that we have at a local level.
I don't know. It's a great question. I think it's a good question to ask, and it's certainly a question that's worth thinking about. And what does that mean? I think at the national level, it's important for the national government to understand why something is working. It doesn't mean that you don't give the money to the institution to do that, but you have to think about who should be funding the research. It doesn't have to be at a very local level, the experimentation, but you can fund it at a larger level and look at experimentation across and say where are things working. But it's a good question. I think the challenge is that in tough budget times, when you have less amounts of money going, can you give money that way? And if not, where can that experimentation happen that you can say, hey, there's something that seems to work in making that happen? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where it's going to come out, but it's a good debate.
We'll have to end it there. I would just add one appendage. I'll add on to her answer, which is, part of the issue is knowing what we mean when we say it's working. Right. And CDBG is a difficult one. So as far as I can tell, there's never been an evaluation of CDBG. to tell whether there are any marginal impacts, or whether they're just shuffling around to do the things they want to do and serve various constituents. And so there's an open question. I mean, the block granting approach is good in the sense that it provides flexibility and allows some for contextuality of your investment. It's dangerous in that oversight and monitoring becomes much more challenging, and it's much easier to just shuffle money wherever you want to shuffle it without any question. But that's my little editorial on this. Please join me in thanking Sonal. This was